Hey there, class. Professor Steve here, and welcome to our lesson on our next group of heterotrophs. Uh, these guys I lump together because they are um, probably the primary consumers, well, not probably, they are the primary consumers of phytoplankton in the ocean. And these three in particular are sort of the groups that I would last classify as zooplankton. So they're consumers, they're heterotrophs, but they're still plankton. They're still subject to the currents. Um, and they each have three very similar but also unique roles in the marine ecosystem, in the marine food web. And so I want to go over them sort of as a group, but point these out. The first is copepods. We've talked about copepods an awful lot, or at least mentioned them a whole bunch of times in the class. And these guys are the main, by far the largest consumers of phytoplankton. And when we talk about phytoplankton being numerous and growing rapidly enough to compete with land plants and land photosynthesizers, that means they accumulate an awful lot of biomass. As a matter of fact, they accumulate more biomass than the trees do have annually if you add up all the phytoplankton in the ocean. And so it only makes sense that the largest consumer of that huge amount of primary production biomass, uh, that the consumers of that make up the most mass collectively than any other organism on Earth. So that is to say that if you add up all the copepods at the height of their growth, I should say over the course of an entire year, including all growth over the entire year, the mass will add up to more mass, more biomass than if you were to add up, say, all the elephants or all the blue whales or any organism, no matter how large or numerous they are, they outweigh them. But these guys are in the group Crustacea. They range to being about, just a little smaller than that actually. 0.2 millimeters is 200 microns, but they can be as large as 2 millimeters. So they're still relatively small, but we're starting to get a lot larger than a protozoa. And they mostly eat phytoplankton, so we call them herbivores. They will eat some types of protozoa, and some of them probably even inadvertently consume some bacteria, but we don't call that a major term for these guys. As I said, their mass is massive, no pun intended. They eat so much phytoplankton that there are so many of them that they add up to weigh more than any other organism combined on Earth. Um, because they're a little larger and they consume so much phytoplankton, they produce larger fecal pellets than any of the other consumers we've gone over so far. Bacteria don't technically create fecal pellets. Protozoa create something that's like fecal pellet-like, but they're not large enough to do this mysterious process, which we'll get to soon enough, and that is they are large enough to sink. So they consume all this organic matter, package it into a fecal pellet that is pre-processed organic matter, and recycle it as poop, and poop that's large enough to sink. These guys are the first of the organisms we've spoken about too that have built into their behavioral patterns the ability to migrate sort of on purpose. So they'll migrate. The pattern we call for them is called vertical migration patterns, and that means up and down in the water column. And so they'll migrate up during one part of the day, whether it's to feed or escape predator or to get something they need, and then they'll migrate down during another part of the day or when conditions are right to do the same thing, either escape a predator, escape too much sunlight, find food, that kind of thing. So one of the reasons they're so good at what they do is their generation time. They can reproduce really quickly. Some of them are on the order of a day, some of them on the order of a week. And we just went over this. They show vertical migration patterns. And they're generally small and filter feeding. And if you put all this together with their filter feeding and mobility, they become very good at what they do, which is eat phytoplankton. They move around via several modified appendages, including antennae. But they can also, if you look here, they generate these feeding currents, which suck all the particles around them towards their feeding apparatus, their mouth apparatus, and that allows them to consume quite a bit of food particles. The second group is also in the group Crustacea, right? So Crustacea is in the um, same family as krill and lobsters and crabs, and these guys are the Euphausiids. Okay, that's their Latin name, but and is a generic name for many different types of, well, it is a family for many different subspecies of what you guys know as krill. Krill, we're starting to get into a much larger organism now, anywhere from 1 to 5 centimeters. They can be a little smaller than that, especially juveniles. But 5 centimeters now, you can start to grasp what 5 centimeters is, and we're starting to look at larger organisms. But again, these guys will consume, the rare protist or other particle, but they're mainly herbivores, so their primary food is phytoplankton. Um, they're larger organisms. They consume not as much as a whole, but probably more as an individual than copepods. But they also waste a lot more, and so they make even larger fecal pellets than the copepods, right? So which means they recycle more organic matter into this packet that can sink. Now we start to see behaviors that we call swarming. They stick together in these schools that swarm around. They also exhibit different types of vertical migration patterns. These guys are everywhere in the ocean pretty much, but they're super dominant in the southern ocean. So let's look at a comparison of these first two critters. They both are large consumers of phytoplankton, right? So phytoplankton is their food source. They eat them. They make more copepods. They also excrete, right? The krill do the same thing. Now what's the significance? These guys eat a lot more. They also reproduce a lot more, which means they are a huge conversion of this primary productivity, this fixed carbon, this autotrophic biomass, into heterotrophic biomass. That means that it's a large step up the trophic food chain. Now, the copepods then are usually eaten by another zooplankton or nekton, a swimmer like this guy, but they're still relatively small. Gelatinous, which means they don't convert a lot of that biomass into biomass because gelatinous guys are made of mostly water. But they can be eaten also by, there are certain very small fishes that will target these guys, such as sardines and that sort of thing. So these are kind of the primary grouping of consumers of these guys. It's basically only one trophic level up from the copepod that consumes them. The difference with the krill is that they can be eaten by each of these groups as well. So this one step up from the herbivore, right? Here's primary productivity is the first step in our pyramid. The herbivores are the second step in our pyramid. And then these guys represent what would be the third step in our pyramid, and they can both be eaten by these guys. But krill can also be targeted, are also often targeted by a larger fish. So either one or more steps up the food chain from this fish. They're also targeted by birds. Again, another one or more step up from this fish. They're also targeted, they're a staple food source of all filter feeding large fish and mammals. The largest mammals on Earth, blue whales, humpback whales, baleen whales. They sift the water out from the water column of the ocean and they trap krill, and that's their main target because they're so numerous and they are such a direct link to phytoplankton that they pack a lot of energy. So everything from the smallest sort of third level consumer up to the largest mammal and even humans can be a direct link from the krill to top predator. Because even humans, certain cultures use krill directly in their food, but much of the food industry uses krill as either flavorings or an ingredient in another food, but we also use them for medicinal purposes and some other things. So the big difference between the copepod and the krill is that copepod needs to be eaten by one of these guys, which can then be eaten by one of these guys, which can then be eaten by a top predator like a human or a larger fish like a shark. Whereas the krill can be consumed directly by these top predators, right? From primary productivity to krill to human or to large fish or large predator. And not much eats a whale, so again, top of the food chain. And so that's the difference, is here we would only have 1, 2, 3 steps in our trophic pyramid, and here we would have bare minimum 1, 2, 3, or 3, and then 4, and then maybe 5 to a top predator. So that's a big difference in transfer of energy in our trophic pyramid, and we'll come back to that with our energy flow lesson, but it's important to point it out here. The third group are salps. Okay, salps are in the same range of sizes as the krill are, but they're a gelatinous. They're in the jelly family. They're a gelatinous zooplankton. They're made up of mostly water. They're entirely filter feeding. They swim around. They swim and pump water through, or they hang in the water and just create these feeding currents and pump all water through, and they trap all small particles. Not just phytoplankton, but they consume an awful lot of phytoplankton, but they trap everything. And since their bodies are only made of 95% water, they package most of it into these large fecal pellets. So for this trophic step with the copepods, the krill, and the salps of them, the salps definitely package the most of the consumed organic matter into fecal pellets, and they're very large. They also start to display some of this behavioral stuff like vertical migration. They form these organic matter mucus houses, so they have a shell or something that they produce around themselves, and they produce a lot of snot from all of this particle consumption, which contributes to the organic matter continuum that we spoke of in the previous lesson. And so does it matter? Does it matter if the fecal pellets are bigger? Does it matter if I crap bigger than you do? If we look at a copepod fecal pellet compared to these long sort of fish-like fecal pellets of a krill, compared to these gigantic fecal pellets of a salp, the answer is yes. Not only do the larger fecal pellets mean you have now packeted a lot more recycled organic matter, but it also makes them a lot heavier and a lot more likely to sink down through the water column. And again, very shortly, I think by the end of the benthic lecture, actually, we'll go over just why is fecal matter sinking so important. Thank you for joining me, and you can move on now to finish this lesson and then go back to the main page and finish off the last group of heterotrophic predators, which is nekton and top predators.